Welcome, everyone, for another session of Eight Principles Voices. I'm Larry Johnson, your host, and I have with me a person I've been looking forward to talking about because it talks about one of my favorite subjects, and it's Mike Krause, who's the co-founder of Conut Media and also the chief operating officer of Outbound, which is a branding organization. Welcome, Mike.
Welcome. Thank you so much, Leigh, for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we're going to talk about some things that I think are very important and things I like talking about, but I want to learn a little more about you first, and I know our audience will want to know more about that. So, can you give us just maybe a little thumbnail of who you are and how you came to where you are today?
Yeah, it's a long story, but I will try to keep it as brief as possible, based on the schedule that we have set today. But I I've spent the last 25 years working in the nonprofit, NGO, CBO sector, both here in the United States and in other parts of the world, mostly in Southern Africa. And to be honest, that was not the original path that I had set for myself. I don't even know if I could say that I had a path set early on. I found myself stumbling into the nonprofit world by accident. When I finished college, I went to the College of Idaho here in Caldwell, Idaho. And as soon as I graduated, I moved to Chicago and I pursued an acting career and did some modeling and ended up moving up to Wisconsin, based out of Madison, and I would travel down to Chicago and Milwaukee and audition for various things. And whereas in the stereotype of the starving artist, many actors will, wait tables and do service industry jobs. I found myself working in a nonprofit, doing some coaching, um, acting coaching specifically for professional actors that had developmental disabilities. And I loved it. I loved the tie into the acting world, but I loved the nonprofit environment. It was filling a need in the community, and that's really what nonprofits do. They step up where for profit and government seem to be lacking in support. And I ended up spending the next 20 plus years just continuing along. And I loved it. I loved every aspect of it. I loved all the organizations I've worked with. And then I decided that I wanted to kind of take more of a panned out view. And I decided to start my own business to support nonprofits with mental performance hurdles, with stress, with trying to optimize performance in an industry that is severely lacking in those resources. They don't always have the budgets to support that. So I wanted to be sort of the bridge to that.
Mhm. So, what happened to the acting career?
There was a point where it kind of just got old. The starving artist, cliche got a little old. It's very exhausting auditioning over and over. And rejection is a real thing that you have to really have some mental stamina to deal with. And my degree in undergrad was in psychology. And I found that through the audition process and really even the roles that I was doing, I was always thinking about on stage or on film about the psychology of the characters. And so I think the psychology won out. And I kind of was imploring and employing some of that in the nonprofit world, and the roles that I had in leadership roles and what have you, and trying to better understand the talent that I was working with. And so, yeah, I think it just became the cycle ended with the acting. I think it basically shifted the energy I had shifted towards wanting to support the nonprofits instead of myself and my acting career.
All right. Okay. Um, I think I heard you say that you were working in a nonprofit that worked with actors with disabilities.
Yeah, there was in Madison, there was this startup nonprofit that was working with adults with developmental disabilities that want, I think the initial scope of it was to almost do acting as therapy, and maybe teach them life skills. But a lot of the actors that we were working with had some amazing talent, And so we, as an organization, started paying them to perform and traveling around and doing original pieces of work. We were not doing Shakespeare. We were not doing Brecht, things like that. We were writing our own themes around topics that were relevant to the actors themselves, what they were struggling with, what they were encountering um, with their lifestyles, and how the community was receiving them. And so we would write original content and perform it, and then paying those actors. And it was a great model, and I still think it's something that we need to see more of.
Oh. So, were any of these people ever go into full blown commercial work, or they stay on the side, or?
I don't know um, where they've sort of ended up. I know that the organization still exists, but I don't know how many of them have moved on to doing, branched out into more commercialized work, or if they kept it more local. But it's definitely opened the doors of opportunities for a lot of them to explore different career options, I guess. We'll put it that way.
All right. Um, well, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm curious, how is that organization funded?
Some private donations, but there was a lot, it was mostly grant funded. Some of that was um, through state funds for the arts, and others were private foundations, philanthropists that wanted to support it.
All right. So now you've moved on. You found you're the operating officer of Outbound. Is that correct?
Global Bound.
Global Bound. I'm confusing it. And then the Conut Media, which is your co-founder, your more recent venture, and you're doing these
Yeah,
parallel, correct?
correct.
So,
So one of my first clients I started working with and coaching a couple years ago, we finished working together, and we decided to keep the conversation going even after our sort of coaching contract ended with each other, and realized that we had a lot of similar goals, motivations. She was starting um, her own businesses on the side, and there was some definite overlap in what we were trying to achieve in the general well-being and wellness and mental health sectors. And so we decided to start up a media company, primarily with the initial goal of starting our own podcast, which we did. We launched that January of 2024. But it was also wanting to kind of come at things from a lot of different angles with health and wellness. And I'm not talking about, just, not really just, sometimes I think we hear this and we think of infomercials about supplements and things like that. And it wasn't really geared about that. It was trying to provide quality content information that was broaching it from various angles. So my partner is a clinical nutritionist, and so she really deals with a lot of physical health components. And I come from it from a mental health component, and just understanding how they really connect. And if we're going to work on mental health, we have to work on physical health, and vice versa.
all right. So, how does this dovetail with the Global Bound? What are you doing there?
It's really interesting because I don't really ever, with the coaching work that I do for nonprofit leaders and the consulting work I do, I've never defined myself as a mental health professional. But so much of what coaching is, and the work I do, focused on helping leaders with mental performance hurdles, things like imposter syndrome, perfectionism, self doubt, and then the stressors that impact those are all mental health related.
Hmm.
And Kona and the podcast that we launched was really almost like a second arm of our own private businesses to kind of help us in market brand not just our businesses, but really kind of this topic about mental health and how it can look in different ways than the traditional therapy. And I'm not downplaying that role, but just that it's a very complicated system and machine, and wanting to provide a different avenue for getting information out there.
So, I'm sure you've worked with nonprofit executives, and so could you talk a little bit about um, what um, the common stressors that you see these people have? You know, is there like a certain two or three of these things that seem to come up over and over again?
Yeah, I would say there's three that I come across on a regular basis. So the first one is that we find in the nonprofit world a lot of people like myself who find themselves in leadership roles that never intended to be in those roles and maybe never intended to be in nonprofits. They had maybe a different career track in mind and found themselves by accident or just through passion. But what happens a lot of times with nonprofits is, especially in smaller communities, you have leaders who get burned out, and that's a huge issue in the nonprofit community. And so the leader moves on, and maybe they've been there for a couple of years, maybe it's even been 10, but there's burnout. And there maybe is a vacuum in the talent in that community. And so they fill it with possibly the next warm body in the room. And it could be someone who's only been there for 6 months or maybe a year and in a different role that's not a executive style leadership role. And that's, I'm not even saying that's a bad thing per se. I think it really allows people to flourish and learn on the job. But you are asking people to step into roles that they're not maybe trained up for in the moment. So then there's a lot of self doubt and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And then that can lead to further burnout for this new executive. So that's one issue. It's just kind of the turnover cycle and where we're um, getting the replacements for those leadership roles. Another issue that I find when I talk with leaders, there's a couple main points that they're always dealing with: fundraising, maintaining adequate funding, and then there's tends to be tension with the board of directors that they work with and sometimes even oversee, which is an interesting conundrum. So fundraising obviously makes sense. There's sort of a mantra in nonprofits of no money, no mission. And it's very apt, but it puts so much added pressure on an executive to constantly be thinking about where's the next grant coming from? What does our donor base look like? Are we growing that? Is that sustainable? What have you? And then the turmoil that comes from not having maybe I don't want to say a qualified board of directors, but you also, in the same light as what I was talking about before, you have board members in nonprofits who've maybe never served on a board before. They come from the business community. They maybe are bankers, lawyers, social workers, doctors, you name it. And they are extreme experts in their area, but they've never served on a board before. And where are
Cor-
they learning?
Corporate or nonprofit,
Yeah,
neither.
exactly.
Right.
And so they step in and almost expected to know from day one, hitting the ground running, what their responsibilities are. And not just for their role, but really for overseeing the entire organization. And so then there's a lot of headbutting going on when there's that maybe lack of communication or lack of understanding between executive leadership and the board. And again, this is not putting blame on either side. It's just stating the reality that we're putting people in positions and almost setting them up to fail sometimes.
Well, the conventional research says that about 75% of nonprofit board members would like formal training or guidance. Only about 20 to 24% actually receive any, which struck me as so like, where is this? I mean, I have clients all the time that I get deer in the headlights when I say, well, can you send me the job description for your board members? What? We have to have a job description?
Mm.
Um, and then this whole idea of the relationship between the board and the executive director or the chief executive, however that person's title is, and from something where the board expects the chief executive to drive it to the part where it more conventional that the board is really the overarching organization that guides the executive and provides support for the executive. And of course, you see, you're talking about this tension that develops, and there's well, from boards, I think there's a lot of sloppy enrollment, or that it's the warm body kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I tell clients, organizations, I say board membership is a responsibility, not a reward. you know
Yeah,
it's a very specific sort of responsibility, and not everyone's cut out for it. and
exactly.
and that doesn't mean that they can't be useful as a volunteer in some other part of the organization. But I've seen it, and I'm sure you have too, where someone does a good job as a volunteer. Oh, we'll put you on the board.
Yep.
And they get to put that on their resume or whatever it is. And they end up being mediocre at best, sometimes worse. Um,
Yep.
let's go back with the executive and the fundraising conundrum. What do you see there? I mean, is it just general anxiety? Is it lack of understanding? Is it kind of I'm just going to put it over here and figure it out later? I mean, or do they try to integrate it into what they're doing? Could you talk a little bit about that in your experience?
Yeah, I think at the very base level, I think it's just a lot of pressure that in a for-profit world, we're talking about revenue, we're talking about profit. Maybe if you're for public, a public entity, then you're talking about your shareholders, what have you. And then a profit world, you have a responsibility to the community that you serve, and possibly that should include the clients or the clientele, whatever that you target. But other than that, primarily your success is based off of if you can keep your doors open. And so I think the inherent pressure that executives feel at that level is very strong. And some of that comes from the board itself, which is ironic because yes, that is the responsibility of the executive and their team, their talent. If they have a development team to bring in to do special events, to do grant writing, to seek out new donors, but the board has a responsibility on that too. And sometimes that gets lost. I think is a bit deviation, but I think a lot of times people come into board roles and think they are strictly advisors, just coming in maybe to meet quarterly and offer their opinion, and they walk out and they've approved they've seen the financial statements and they approve it and then say, okay, we'll see you in 3 months. And there is still a responsibility when you look at the number of nonprofits, um, honestly, even registered within the state of Idaho. Um, I think we technically have about 6,000 registered nonprofits. About 2,500 of them are actually active. For a population of 2 million people in the state of Idaho, that's a lot per capita. And they all should have boards. Um, it's really, you know, tough to find that many people who are active in that role. And then you're also asking, if you're asking basically to have a minimum of 3 to 5 board members to be operational across 2,000 nonprofits around the state, and one of their roles is to keep the organization financially stable and secure. And yet, it's one of the biggest concerns or frustrations or stressors for for the board is they don't know how to ask for money. They don't know how to go out, ask their friends, their family, business leaders. So you're asking a great number of people to be on boards, and they're terrified of fundraising and fund development for the organization. And so then that fear gets pushed onto the executive and their team. It's like, we don't really know how to do this. We're not comfortable doing it, but you guys are paid to do it. So just make it happen. So there's a lot of pressure on that end.
Well, you've set me up now, Mike, and I just want to say to my viewers that I did not set you up on purpose. All right, it's not on purpose, but I did want to hear this. You've drawn attention to a couple of very important things or misconceptions about how that dynamic works. First, let's talk about the nonprofit board. A nonprofit board really only has three responsibilities. The first one is the obvious one, the governance oversight with policy, not operations. The
Yep.
second one is they need to be strong advocates of the organization. And that means speaking well to anyone who will listen, how the great work and advocating the impact. And third is ensuring that the organization has sufficient resources to deliver the mission. And for a nonprofit, almost well, almost always there is some philanthropic component to that. I mean, it could be fee for service and other things that are involved, but there's usually some philanthropic component, and that's where it begins to break down. When you said fundraising, asking for money, well, we've had this discussion before, as you know, and I'm going to tell you for the viewers again, it's really not about asking for money. Now, money's involved, all right. And there is a transfer of one
Mm.
kind or the other, but the focus should be on the relationship between the organization and the investors. And I think the best way to describe it would be effective philanthropy is on the same model, believe it or not, as the typical fundraising sequence for a tech startup. They have investors who have resources, in this case, at all levels, small, big, whatever. And their reasons for being involved in the organization vary. All right. Now, unlike the tech startup, it's not all financial.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there again, their reasons may not be immediately obvious. And so instead of an execution avenue here by the nonprofit, I'm going to go out and get money and apply it to my execution. Think of it more as you're drawing in potential investors and investors who are coming in to offer their resources to you because of their own reasons. All right.
Yep.
Then it becomes a partnership between, in this case, the executive of the organization and maybe any development staff that's involved and board and those investors. So then it becomes, instead of an extraction, number one, it's an invitation to participate. Number two, it's two parties, investors, organizations, coming together to accomplish something that neither can do alone. All
Yep.
right. And when you begin to look at it that way, and you have to also remember that 90% of all the philanthropic monies comes from individuals, one way or the other. The
Yep.
very little of it comes from corporations or organized foundations. It's mostly individuals, and I'm talking about direct giving because we're in Idaho. We see all this transactional fundraising all the time, the galas, the events, and when I tell people, last year I think it was like $480 billion was given to philanthropy in this country, and when I say to people that of that 1/10 of 1% of that 480 billion was given through these transactional methods, they kind of they're like stupefied that that's not where the money is really coming from, you know. But it's the organizations that do it very, very well consistently are those that have that paradigm, and then the organization itself and the board is aligned to thinking in that manner. You see, and then the executive's position then is to sort of get out of the way, kind of point the direction, but kind of get out of the way.
Yep.
Tell me about, I want to talk about executives in another way. One thing that's been proposed, and I want your reaction to this. A good friend of mine, who's one of the national researchers in the fundraising business and philanthropy, he makes the comment, and I tend to agree with him, that executives often, nonprofit executives often get in the way of being effective when they take on a personal sort of, this is my mission, and I'm
Mm.
going to go out there and get it done. And then they see everything else as sort of feeding into that. In other words, they kind of want to be the star of their own show, of their own story. Okay. And that gets in the way because in a philanthropic environment, those investors want to be a serious part. Not, I mean, they want to come in and run the place, but that's the last thing they want to do. But that it's really funneling those investors' desires into your organization in a way that produces this momentum and the funds. Do you see, um, you know, executives just like so consumed with what they want to accomplish in their personal missions that that kind of gets in the way of this? I mean, do you see any of that?
I love it. I think you, again, for your listeners, you didn't set me up. Well, you did, but we didn't plan this out, which is yes. Everyone within an organization can also be the greatest hindrance to the organization. And that can be the executive as well as the board members specifically. But I mean, I see it all throughout. And the hurdle that they are putting in front of themselves is they're making it about themselves. Nonprofit work, and honestly, I would even say this in the for-profit industry, but my background expertise is in nonprofits. Um, I do board development stuff with and trainings and workshops with boards, and one of my key messages, and it's also for when I talk about leadership for the paid staff of an organization, is it's not about you. You are a steward of the organization, meaning you are a caretaker for this community, for this organization, and your sole purpose is to continue the mission, the vision, the outreach, the connection, the relationships. Um, and then when you leave, which you will at some point, whether on your own accord or when you pass away in office, whatever that looks like.
Or otherwise, which is usually
Yes,
someone asks you to leave, and that happens too
it's
often.
way too often. The organization needs to continue. Um, and so the stewardship mindset is key at all levels of the organization, that it is the mission is bigger than any one individual. And where I find the biggest hurdle in what I do, specifically around the coaching for these leaders, is asking for help from someone like myself. And the reason I find is it's a couple things. But one, if I need to ask for a stress coach, a resilience coach, a mental performance coach, like an executive coach like Mike to come in and support me, then I'm somehow giving, a cue to my board, to my staff, to the community that I'm somehow not capable, that I need support, which is complete BS. Um,
Well,
the idea that even
Aristotle, and then Aristotle, or is it Socrates? No, it's Aristotle, and also St. Paul both said the beginning of wisdom is the admission of ignorance.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
know, you when you realize you don't know it all, now you're getting somewhere. Now you can grow. Now you can, of course, my good friend, well, not personal friend, but my good friend Marcus Aurelius
Mm.
fits that as well. That when you realize that you bring just part of the picture with you, and that you can grow from this. You see, it's that fear of having to be perfect when it's impossible to be perfect.
Yeah, that's the one of the mental performance hurdles that I find is we need to debunk this idea that any one person in their role and really in life needs to be perfect. I'm not the perfect husband. I'm not the perfect father to my two dogs. I try and I can try and be better. I'm not the perfect coach. I try to be better. Um, but I think one of the things, maybe the term that I'll throw out here that I really latching onto and talking with clients about is toxic resiliency. This concept that we need to burn ourselves out, that our culture is telling us that we have to be everything to everyone at all points in time, that we have to work harder. Because I mean, I remember this when I was growing up, it was this sports metaphor that I'll go back to for your listeners, where watching the Chicago Bulls back in the heyday and their successes, and Michael Jordan did so many different films and interviews, and the main theme was him always talking about how you know, he realized in his mind that if he wasn't working, 24/7 honing his craft, that there was someone out there who would and was. So this fear of someone's going to beat me and overtake me and whatever. And I think it's great if you, in terms of maybe drive, but at the same time, we can't all perform at the way that Michael Jordan did in his training. I mean, there's consequences to it. And for most of us, it will impact our relationships in our personal life. It will impact and ripple out to the relationships in our nonprofit organization, to our talent, to the community members that are supporting our organization. So this idea that we have to constantly be rebounding and bouncing back and just keep diving in, jumping back in the pool, um, and get beat up. And then we hold that up as a badge of honor. Um, and so, but then we don't ask for help. And so that's, it's a huge issue. And when you don't ask for help, you're also saying, almost doubling down on, it is about me,
Mhm.
and not about the organization and where this organization is going.
Um, the metaphor that this researcher uses, and I've sort of adopted, is it's it's like producing a film. You know, the people that get the screen time are the investors. All right, but ever more important than the people in front of the camera is the producer, the director, all the other pieces of the puzzle. I mean, certainly, I like older films, Mike, and one of my favorite directors is Alfred Hitchcock,
Hmm.
and he certainly did not consider himself in any way second to the men and women that were on the screen. Absolutely not. If you know anything about him, he always got, his name was always the biggest one on the screen, always, and his little habit of always having a cameo appearance. Maybe it was only 5 or 6 seconds on film that he walks across the camera or the field.
Yeah.
Um, and what I know of him is that he was very, very prescriptive in the instructions he gave the actors and the actresses. There wasn't any of this free form. I think you'll do. No, I want you to move your head this way and do this way and do this way and do this way. And that's very exacting. And either you liked that or you didn't. And he was very particular about the people that he worked with. But there again, he knew it wasn't really about him. There's a bigger thing going on here. And he was perfectly happy being behind the camera, not in front of the camera. And so that's part of that. I like to say, God save me from nice people, Mike, because they're so well motivated that gets in the way of understanding the bigger picture here. And so can we shift gears here a little bit? Okay,
Let's do
we've
it.
talked about coaching and executives, and I wanted to make sure we had that discussion. Let's talk about branding for nonprofits. Now, everyone, you say branding, everyone thinks graphic design, web, publications, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I'll give you, I'll date myself. When I first was in the business and working with nonprofits and working for Ketchum, the consulting firm, and doing fundraising publications and campaign brochures and that kind of thing, it was still all print and strip. And anytime you wanted to make a change, it was a physical change and the board had to be reworked. And of course, that took time and it took money.
Hmm.
It wasn't just, oh, well, let's move this around on the page and then bingo, bingo, bingo. It took a lot of time. And then to get the board restripped and to do it again, to have it photographed and all that. So today it's so easy. And yet it hasn't really made it any better, all right, than the bad old days, at least that I can see. I mean, in terms of the final product, it may be a little bit more glitzy and glamour, but the issues still remain. What is the brand? And then what are the representations of that brand? You want to dive into that for me?
When I think of branding, and I love that you talk about sort of the image side, the graphic design side, the stuff that we always associate, this sort of technical piece. And I think the branding comes down to and not to beat a dead horse, but it really comes down to me for nonprofits of that stewardship. Because when you look through the lens of stewardship, everything gets a little clearer. When you talk about, okay, so what does it mean to be a leader then? Um, well, how about you look about what does it mean to be a leader when you look through the lens of stewardship? What about being providing support and whatever that means? It's a very broad term, but look through the lens of stewardship and then look at support and what that looks like and how that trickles down. And I say this because when you do that, it is very obvious to everyone else. They see it, they experience it. It's about how you make people feel. And that's really what nonprofits do is they are making their communities that they serve feel supported and loved and seen and heard. And you do that when you look through the lens and behave through the lens of stewardship. Um, and so obviously that talks about what's the culture of that organization, what are the shared values of the people there, and it comes back to what we were just talking about. If it's not about you, if you're constantly trying to set others up for the win, that's a stewardship piece. Your clientele, whatever that looks like, will feel that. That comes through in hospitality, it comes through in customer service, it comes through in relationship building, it comes through in communication, it comes through in empathy. It's funny that I talk with leaders and I will say, I can have a room full of people and say, okay, what are the top 10 qualities of a good leader? And I can go through that exercise and I can get, and there's, let's say, 20 people in a room or 50 people in a room, and they all give me 10 different things. And then I go a week later and I do the same thing with another group of 20 or 50 people, whatever. Over time, I get the same damn words. It's the same criteria of what makes a good leader. And yet we have organizations and businesses run by people who say on paper, I embody this, this, and this. And it's the same list that these groups of people are telling me. And yet in practice, it's not fulfilled.
There.
So it's how you fulfill that. It's how you make other people feel that. And again, if you perform that through the lens of stewardship, that's what's seen, heard, felt, believed, embodied, embraced by the community. Um, and it's very simple. I think we also, on a kind of maybe a sidetrack, I think we overcomplicate it,
Hmm.
the branding piece. I think we try to get so creative and we try to come up with some viral pitch or phrase that we can showcase to everybody. Um, Here's a great example. Actually, I just read this. I've known about this for a few years, but it came across my newsfeed this morning. It was talking about Costco and their Costco hot dog at their food court,
Hmm.
and how Costco has not changed the price of a hot dog and soda really since it became a staple in 2008, I think is what it was, and it said in the article. And the reason for it is because that's part of their branding is they are willing to take a loss on selling the actual price based on inflation should be about $4.50. So they're losing $3 of profit, or at least revenue,
Hmm.
uh, by keeping it at $1.50. And yet they realize that that is part of their brand, that they would lose so many people of their memberships and people frequently going in that is the reason people are going in. It's the experience. It's being felt they were being valued by something as simple as $1.50 hot dog and soda. Um, so when you start making it and realizing through the lens that it's not about you, how can you set up others for the win? In this case, for Costco, it's their customers. You're creating an environment for them to come in, have a family meal if that's the case, or having a snack while they're doing shopping, but it's creating an environment, it's creating a brand, it's creating a culture between their employees and the community. Um,
Can
but it
I?
wasn't about them.
I want to pick up on that. Let's go back to the role that your investors or slash donors are playing. All right, you
Hmm.
see, they're coming for some of those same reasons. See, that's why it's not about the money with these people. It's
Hmm.
about the relationship and what they gain from it. Um, and it's that you also mentioned the word culture. I want to underline that because people often think of fundraising as some activity that's kind of sitting over here somewhere, and they're the people that do it, and it outcomes the money, as opposed to it's a product of a way of life and a culture in the organization that includes the investors in a certain way. I'll give you the example that I love to talk about anyway. I'm sure you've been at a Ritz-Carlton hotel at some point in your life,
Mm.
and you know that they are the number one in the luxury hotel market. But they're not number one because of their outstanding facilities, although they're nice. They're not shabby. It's the way they make their guests feel when they're there.
Yeah.
And they do it in such a pervasive and consistent way. You see, it isn't hit or miss, you know. And the one thing that the ways and they well, first of all, they have a culture, but the way they ensure that culture and strengthen it is an incredible top down, inside out training program that everyone from the chambermaid to the general manager goes through continually. It's not a once and done thing, and they mix the groups together. They're not hierarchical. Everybody comes together in a group so that everybody knows their role in dealing with the guests, whatever that might be, and they empower them. I'll give you the personal example that I had a number of years ago. I was uh, I was living out in Western New York at the time, and I'd flown out to the Los Angeles area, Pasadena. I had a meeting there, and I was staying at the Huntington Park Ritz Carlton, which is there in Pasadena at least, and that's kind of a long flight. And I'd flown all the way across the country and fought that traffic, afternoon traffic up to Pasadena. And so I arrived and I'm a little bit tired. So I get out. Of course, you drive in and the valet is there and it's all the deluxe service. And you walk in and the lady at the desk says, after I checked, well, she says, hello, how are you? And she says, would you like someone to help you with your bag? I was just going to be there like 2 nights. I had a very small bag. And I said, I think I can find it for myself. And at this point, I was just like zoned out. Let me get to the room, go forward. Well, this is not your typical corporate hotel. It is a 1 or 2 story hotel over a large piece of property, and it's very sprawling and goes in all these different directions. Well, I started walking. I said, "Well, can you?" She pointed me in the direction. I started walking. Very quickly, I realized I am lost. There is no way I'm going to find my room in this thing. So I looked over and there was a restaurant, obviously pretty nice because the maitre d' was wearing a white tie, very formal. So here I am in my chinos and my polo shirt, and I walk over there and I say to the gentleman, I said, can you sort of tell me your appointment in the direction of room 152? That's what it is. I remember that. And with such seamlessness, Mike, with such lack of just it was so natural. His response was, well, I could, but I'd much rather take you there myself. And at the same time, gently, with just enough pressure, taking my bag out of my hand. He never once looked back at his station, and he headed out with me. Obviously, there was someone else there to take his place immediately. You're not going to leave that standing open. So we're walking down to the room, and he opens the door and checks everything, and then he declines a tip. And I said, well, is there a place I can have dinner close by in an open shirt? He said, certainly. It's just down the hall and to the left. I said, fine. So I freshened up a little bit, and then I walked down to this restaurant, more casual restaurant, and there was a lady there at the hostess desk. Now, when I travel alone, I always take a book with me. That's what I do. So I walk up to her, and all she asks is one thing: your room number. And I gave her my room number. And Mike, it was almost spooky. Almost without breaking eye contact, here's what she says to me. Good evening, Mr. Johnson. It's a pleasure to welcome you. You've had a very long trip. I'll make sure you get a table with plenty of light for your book. Now, think about that. Now, do I want to go back? Like, yes, next week, maybe, you see. So that's what they've been able to achieve. but it didn't get there by accident, and it didn't get there with sort of an off and on thing. It's that stewardship. It's that this is what we do. And if I don't know if you know anything about their mission is, ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen.
Mm,
That's what they do. I mean, uh, and it's the way, it's that interaction between the people. But think about that, and that was almost spooky, Mike, when she did that. It's like, and that's before tagging and GPSs and all that stuff. I mean, they had this down just with the electronics in the on-site when I checked in, and all that was in my profile. And then she had seen the book down by my side. Obviously,
yeah,
she took a lot in at that point, and that takes training.
that's
It,
brilliant. And one of the things you said early on that I really like is you use the word consistency. And whether we're talking about culture, we're talking about leadership, we're talking about stewardship, anything across the board, that consistency matters. And not just in the execution, but in it, coming back to the branding question, when we are hoping that people in our community, in whatever facet, understand, recognize, believe in us, they do that through consistency.
Mhm.
Meaning, you can be the Ritz Carlton of whatever, but if you only do it from time to time and it's not consistent, it doesn't matter how great the hospitality was. If you go back to that same Ritz Carlton and you don't have the same experience, um, you're like, okay, so that was just a fluke. That was a one off. And one thing that we don't like as people is uncertainty. We thrive off of certainty, hence why we create habits and routines in our daily lives. And that consistency piece, when we're talking about our culture, especially in the workplace, it's not something that you just teach somebody in an onboarding session for like 3 hours and then you never revisit it. You've got to keep bringing that stuff up. You've got and it's not even talking about, you've got to live it. You've got a role model. That's almost, if nothing else, maybe the most important aspect of what a nonprofit leader needs to be doing at the executive level is they need to be role modeling this consistent behavior, attitude, vision, values, you name it. And that I think is hard when, I'm not a big poo-pooer of, the turnover piece with organizations where people are gauging their success by the number of, the percentage of turnover they have annually. I think turnover is good. Turnover is a good thing. It depends on why people are turning over. The downside, though, is you don't always have that consistency when you have high turnover. And if you're having high turnover at the executive level because of burnout, who's role modeling the values of that culture
or a
to
mismatch
everyone else?
between expectations, the board versus the
Yeah.
person who's in there. Lack of communication, lack of
Yeah.
congruence. Um, I like talking to you, Mike. This is great. This is great. And you're feeding all my prejudices, and I love it. So, um, is there anything else that you think we ought to be talking about here? Is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to highlight?
And it's not meant to be a self-promotion piece by any means. I think
Well, you're welcome to do that here, by the way. That's not.
uh, I I don't even do that when I'm not doing podcasts. It's probably my biggest self-inflicted wound that I do to myself is I'm probably not trying to sell myself and my services as well. But honestly, I'm more interested in the message and if we can normalize the behaviors out there and that consistency piece too about everything we've talked about and helping realize with the coaching piece that there's no downside to it. There really isn't. I mean, if you're a nonprofit leader and honestly you're a business leader across the board, regardless of what industry you're in, there's no downside to receiving support. I don't, there's, you can take the CEO of a major Fortune 500 company and um, they don't know how to reset the Wi-Fi in their building, in their headquarters. They don't know how to update the website. They don't know how to do social media. There's a lot of things they don't know how to do, and that's okay.
That's
And
not
yet, I
their
think
job.
sometimes
That's not really their focus.
no. And yet, somehow, when we get into the nonprofit sphere, We're expecting our leaders to have their fingers in the pot of everything and know everything at all points in time. And we've done this at their detriment because we don't always provide them with the resources. And when I say we, I'm kind of specifically referring to the board here, but
Mm.
I'm not trying to finger point necessarily. It's just saying that we expect too much without the resources to do it. But one of the resources that we can provide is this level of support from an outside source like a coach who can come in and help them learn how to manage their stress. I talk about it in terms of preventive maintenance. Coaching is preventive maintenance. It's like taking your car in to get the oil changed, the tires rotated. If you don't do that, yeah, you can still, the car's still going to run. And then there's a point where it's not. And you're going to be like, oh, crap. And now I'm going to spend $10,000 to fix it versus if you had spent $250, every quarter for the last 10 years kind of thing. Coaching is the same thing. It's a preventive maintenance tool, coaching up leaders to learn how to manage stress, how to process disappointment when that grant doesn't come through, how to learn how to communicate from a perspective that's not out of anger and frustration with their board when they're not pulling their weight or whatever it is. Um, it's just that steady undercurrent that we have, as we're now in springtime here in Boise, and we have the Boise River flowing and at high levels. I think of coaching as that undercurrent under the water that we don't always see, but it's always moving it forward. And coaching is that thing that you invest in it for your leaders, for your talent. It's not just the CEO or the ED. Invest it for the entire talent. And here's another example of something I was doing. I was at a leadership retreat a couple of weeks ago with a bunch of nonprofit leaders, about 20 of them from around the state of Idaho. And one of them had said that when he took over the role recently, he said to the board, I'll take this job, but I want $12,000 annually for outside coaching services for myself. So that was in addition to the pay that they were offering him. He's like, I want professional development and I want it in this form. Honestly, that's my biggest thing is and that's really what I've been spending the last 2 years doing is helping nonprofits from the board level down just put in some line items in your budget for professional development. You'd be surprised at how many don't have that
Oh,
for anything, not for webinars, for conferences, nothing. Um, but maybe start out small, put in a line item for professional development for every staff member. And then as you keep growing it every year, which you should, also designate some of that for coaching for everybody. And I do group coaching, I can do one-on-one coaching, but this is that role modeling piece. We have to role model if you want a healthy, invigorated, innovative, creative, steward focused organization.
I love that.
You have to support people in that way, and they have to role model that for the community and say, oh, this is normal. This is the normative behavior that's out there.
I love that. I love it. Um, as a way of sort of dovetailing that, I've done a lot of travel in my during my career, and on two separate occasions, one in Colorado, one in Southern California, and neither of these locations was a Ritz-Carlton location. It was a restaurant and a hotel that wasn't anyway. And in both cases, the waitress that was waiting on me for dinner that night said something that I'd only heard at the Ritz-Carlton. And we go everywhere and we do business, and someone will say thank you, and the proverbial thing that comes back that makes my skin crawl: no problem. What do you mean
Mm.
no problem? I mean, tell me, what is that supposed to mean anyway? Well, these two ladies both said to me, it's my pleasure.
Mm.
And so I told them, only place I've ever heard that's been at the Ritz Carlton. Both of those ladies had worked at the Ritz and got trained there, and now we're working elsewhere. But that stayed with them on how to interact with their customers. Um, Needless to say, they both got really good tips.
Yeah.
So it's like, wow, just the way it makes you feel and that consistency. And that was a holdover. So anyway, that's a nice way of dovetailing it. How would someone reach you? What's an easy way for people to get to you?
I do have a contact me form on my website on globalbound.org. So it's www.globalbound.org, and globalbound is one word. Or my email address is mike@globalbound.org. I'm also on LinkedIn.
Okay.
So find me there, and yeah, please reach out. I love chatting with people. Even I say this all the time when I do speaking engagements for different things and workshops. If you just want to grab coffee, a virtual coffee in person, I don't care where you live. We can always jump on a call. I just love talking about this stuff, and maybe we can brainstorm some things. And it's never an obligation to contract with me in any way. I'm here to sell stuff, but I'm not really here to sell stuff. So
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, very, very much. This has been a pleasure. Uh,
thanks, Larry, for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
everyone out there, we've had a delightful hour. This just sped by. One of my favorite topics was somebody who certainly knows what the heck they're doing. And so, in next time, we'll do another leader in the nonprofit world some way. So until then, we'll see you.